Hello everyone, Tucker here at BioWare Follower, and I have a bit of a unique video based on a topic of conversation that was going on in the Anthem subreddit, which as of right now has about 44 comments. This is a topic about hearing disability in the gaming industry, or accommodating those who have hearing disability. And this isn't unique to BioWare, this is unique to the gaming industry in general, but a reason why I'm kind of bringing this up is my roommate is hard of hearing. So everyone, this is Paul.
Hi, how's it going?
Paul, as well as myself, we are game design master students. He's actually about to graduate, but we're going to kind of discuss how hard of hearing, the difference between making a game that is hard for hearing, or is
hearing impaired.
Hearing impaired? Okay, sorry. Is how it's more helpful for those that are hearing impaired with a multiplayer game rather than hearing impaired for single player. Because single player, you can just do subtitles. So Paul is going to be here kind of giving his own examples and previous experience of playing games with assistance for those, as well as just some other ideas. But before I get too much into it, I do want to note it was noted, Brendan Holmes did comment on that thread saying that they do have colorblind stuff up and running. I hope I pronounced these correctly, but the three options that they currently have is, for colorblindness, protanopia, deuteranopia, and tritanopia. So, there we go. So, Paul, what is your experience with this stuff?
Okay, so as a hearing impaired individual, I do want to actually kind of follow up on your topic of how more or less hearing impaired individuals are accommodated in single player mode first before I get on the multiplayer stuff.
Sure, that's fine.
So there is a bit of a misconception, and it's not anybody's fault. I would say it's because there's just not really a lot of information when dealing with somebody who is hearing impaired and how to best accommodate that. And it's completely understandable because like maybe less than 1% of the population is hearing impaired. I'm not to go off onto it too much, but I'm actually doing a final presentation on the topic, so I have my numbers researched. I digress. Effectively in single player mode, yes, subtitles are very, very helpful. One thing I noticed that game companies do occasionally, and that is kind of lackluster in my experience, is they will initially start out a cinematic in a game without subtitles enabled, and not actually give you an option to access subtitles until after that cinematic has finished, effectively making somebody who is hearing impaired turn the subtitles back on and hope that they can get back to that cinematic to rewatch it to understand it. But I'm not talking about grinding my gears here, more so as what it means to accommodate somebody who's hearing impaired in single player mode first before getting on the multiplayer. So in single player mode, like I said, subtitles are helpful, but also there is not really a lot of assistance in terms of providing audio cues for hearing impaired individuals. Sometimes we have, as players out of a game, we have a need for player feedback for different aspects of our gameplay experience, and that can take form in things like in Zelda, for example. When you unlock a door, you are able to see what door it is that you unlocked, or whatever aspect of a puzzle that you interacted with, whatever it is that it does, you're able to more or less get that feedback. And some of these feedback cues come through audio as well as visual. And as it stands, in single player mode, there's not really an accommodation for that particular form of feedback. Now, you know, in an online environment, you know, we'll shift over to that now. In an online environment, as you mentioned, you don't really have subtitles as a luxury there to kind of help guide the player. I would mention that in some instances, for example, I'm an avid player of Final Fantasy 14. And while I don't specifically need to use the feature myself because my hearing loss has not progressed to that level of necessity yet, Final Fantasy 14 does have a feature that allows people who are hearing impaired and or deaf to still pick up on some of that audio player feedback that they may otherwise be missing without it. And so this, and how they go about doing this is they display these reverberations on the screen that are more or less in position on the UI, wherein, or they would be positioned on a location that would be relevant to wherever that audio source is. And so not only does this like show as like a water ripple effect, for example, or whatever, when these audio cues play, but they come in a variety of colors that indicate like what sound is supposed to be what. Like red, for example, is aggressive, and like blue, for example, is like an ambient sound, or like water rushing or something like that. And Final Fantasy XIV's case, that's particularly important because there are some fights that rely on that audio player feedback in order to effectively do. Like the Leviathan fight, for example, utilizes that when the player is not able to see Leviathan landing on one side of the boat because the camera is only so large and it can only zoom out so far. You're forced to rely on audio cues to get a sense of where Leviathan currently is in the grand scheme of things. And so it's an interesting take on how those accommodations kind of work. And in an online environment, you have the option of, in terms of actually specifically accommodating, you have the options of implementing a system like that. Of, you know, a visual representation of audio feedback. In addition to, like, for example, if we're talking like how Super Smash Bros., for example, has taunts that the character uses, you can still kind of sort of use subtitles there and more or less communicate through that and those short little sound clips. You know, you would want to keep it stationary on screen in a general place, as opposed to making the player try to follow it around or anything. But you can do that.
There's also emotes. Like if you know, a lot of games have emotes that your character can wave, they can dance, they can do something, they can point, things like that.
Yeah, no, and as I recall, there was actually a deaf group. A whole deaf rating group. I don't remember if it was Destiny or if it was some other online game. I know it was an online game of some sort. And so there was a fully deaf group that communicated based on like visual instance. Like they were like dancing, for example, to communicate different stages of a fight and whatnot, or like to give different directions.
I just looked it up, and the guild that you're thinking of is in World of Warcraft.
Oh, yeah, was it? Okay.
Yep, it was World of Warcraft.
Oh, okay. I couldn't remember for the life of me. I know I picked it up somewhere, though.
And I'm looking through the comments here. Some of them are interesting, but some of them have responses. But there's one from a person on Reddit named Ukimio. He says, I don't know if it's possible, but Sea of Thieves has a great chat wheel that is context aware. If you're holding or doing something, it gives text options that are unique to that. So in Sea of Thieves, you know, if you're holding nothing and you're pulling up the text wheel, they'll have things of wave, dance, sit down, laugh, things like that. But if you pull out a compass it will say there's something to the north, something to the east, something south, something west, something, there's a ship in this direction, something like that. But then if you put the compass away and you pull out a map, it'll say, the treasure is nearby, the treasure is over the hill, the treasure is buried nearby. So it's context aware. How do you feel about that? How would you feel like that would work?
Honestly, I think that is a really kind of good idea, and it's not specific just to accommodating for hearing loss. Those types of feedback, they kind of add to the experience for not just hearing impaired individuals, but people with hearing. And because that's a unique form of visual feedback. And I would also argue too that facilitates communication between language barriers. When you have people of different dialects and different cultural backgrounds, you're able to more effectively communicate that way without like using any voices or without need for language and whatnot. So it's definitely a welcomed addition, and everybody benefits from it.
There's also another thing that was brought up, which is because Anthem is a multiplayer, it's a shooter game, there's moments where you're going to be shot at from something that you might not see on screen. Now, the kind of common way that I've seen other shooters do it is that if you're being shot at by something to the right of you, the right side of the screen will blur a little bit, or it'll change color. Is there any other maybe suggestion that you can think of, or any other idea?
So in favor of not really giving away a unit-specific position, and that sounds like a pretty good accommodation as it stands, or like something that kind of like hints a direction without exactly giving it away. You could incorporate something like I said earlier, Final Fantasy XIV has those reverberations on screen, for example. You could just have it not originate out of the spot exactly where that unit is, but instead more of a blurred type of reverberation or something that kind of like indicate its sense of direction, but not so precise that it automatically takes the fun out of it. But yeah, outside of that, I would maybe offer specific classes or specific like abilities that maybe allow you to get a better idea of where units are, and it doesn't necessarily have to be immediately visible out in the world, but more so maybe like on the UI, like on a compass or something. There's a majority of ways, and if we're talking specifically about like classes and or like jobs, for example, there could be one that kind of like has a detect option, or like something that's better at finding certain enemies over other ones, or whatever, and giving that kind of option allows people who are hearing impaired to still have a method of play, even if it isn't the greatest. There's still something they can do. Now, I'm not saying that that's the ideal path. Yeah,
and that's also that's a gameplay change.
Yeah,
that is something that those who can hear, they can use that too. Which that's a good suggestion. I mean, we're just trying to think of how can developers who might be listening to this, people who want to go into the industry, or someone who's just working on their own small game, how can they just help people who are hearing impaired? Because there are people that are hearing impaired, they enjoy video games, but I'm pretty sure that there's a decent amount of video games that they don't have that immersion to, because they can't hear as well for it.
The general feedback or the general advice I would have for those developers is more or less in their QA sessions to more or less have QA that's centered around being like accommodating to people with disabilities, not just people who are hard of hearing or with hearing loss. You want to kind of like test, like, because there's quality assurance sessions that test to see how well a UI reacts with somebody, or how well a menu does or does not function. And so there's not really much of a, for lack of a better word, excuse for not being able to utilize that same type of process to check for people or for that accommodation level to see if those accommodations are properly working. And and this is just my limited scope of how current accommodations have come about. I definitely implore developers to keep experimenting to see what works and what doesn't, and to get that feedback from people who are actually hearing impaired to tweak it and make it work, and then allow other developers to see that and build off of it as they implement in their projects.
And I feel like saying this is a bit bad, but I mean, they could simply test it by muting the computer or muting the TV and having them play the game and see how well can they pick up on things.
Well, it's not bad. You would just be more or less testing for a certain type of hearing impairment.
Okay.
At that point, because hearing loss comes in a variety of forms, and it's not just on or off or partial. There's a variety of different types of hearing loss, and it really depends on what specifically you're attempting to accommodate for. And in all fairness, that's not a bad idea, because it's the most extreme out of all of the hearing losses.
Yeah, I mean there's there's a spectrum of you can hear, you can not hear, and then there's every option in between.
Pretty much. But no, and you can kind of get that, but at the same time, you want to utilize somebody who is actually hearing impaired, because there is a general, there's people who are hearing impaired tend to compensate for their hearing loss in certain ways that people who are hearing or who are able to hear will not immediately be able to transfer over into during those QA sessions. And so you're potentially losing that level of complexity, I guess, for your feedback, because you're kind of sort of simulating hearing loss, but you're not actually simulating someone who is deaf or hard of hearing. So it's close, but I would wager that you might miss a few things.
Okay. So kind of going back to what I started with this, when Brendan Holmes talked about, or he didn't talk about it, and he kind of replied there about some of the colorblind stuff. You can easily throw on the switch and kind of test around a few things, but if you actually bring someone in that is that type of colorblind, they can help you more than just a normal person doing the tests.
Yeah, no, and for all intents and purposes, I don't believe a normal person who does not have color blindness would be able to more or less register how the colorblind appropriate colors would be, and you see what I'm saying? Yeah. So they wouldn't effectively be able to say whether or not it worked. You would probably want to ask somebody who is actually colorblind to check for it.
I'm sure that they do.
Yeah, no.
I'm sure that they do have some stuff set up. I mean, Karis doing some of the art stuff, she talks about that they do have some graphs set up for that, but that can't compare to actually bringing someone in with the disability that you're assisting. You can't compare to that, because having someone who does have that disability actually trying to play your game, you're gonna find out things that are completely different.
Right.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up this video?
Not necessarily, though. I would say that if there are any developers that are actually listening to this, hi, by the way, I'm looking for a job.
Aren't we all?
I'm very qualified.
All right, well, thank you for kind of popping in. I mean, this really was a last-minute thing. I was reading the subreddit. I was reading that a few minutes ago and just grabbed the microphone, and decided to sit down. But let us know in the comments of kind of what your thoughts and takeaways were on this. And, while you're down there, give this video a like and hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next video.